The state does need to legitimate itself. And that's our avenue of hope. That's where democratic innovations do have the potential to make some difference.
It's very rare that we actually focus on the internal deliberative quality of administrative organizations. If we're deliberative democrats, why would we not want administrative organizations to also be organized deliberatively?
Welcome to Democratic Innovations, the podcast series where we explore how democratic innovations are reshaping the landscape of citizen participation in response to the ongoing crisis in representative democracy. I'm Roberto Falanga, researcher at the University of Lisbon, and I'll be your host. In this fourth episode, we're focusing on the role that democratic innovations play within democratic systems with a focus on public administration. This topic raises several questions about the burdens that bureaucracy often places on innovating the public sector, as well as the importance of skilled civil servants in the development of participatory practices. Is bureaucracy a necessary evil? And what skills are needed today to put civil servants in the conditions to make the best out of democratic innovations? To help us navigate this topic, we have invited two excellent speakers, Professor Stephen Elstub and Dr. Rikki Dean. Stephen Elstub is the Director of Research at the School of Geography, Politics and Sociology at Newcastle University. His main research interests are, among others, the theory and practice of democracy, democratic innovation, civil society, and citizen participation. Rikki Dean is Deputy Director of the Democratic Innovations Research Unit at Goethe University Frankfurt. His research combines, among other topics, democratic theory, public administration theory, and empirical social science about democratic governance. Together with them, we will dive into the role of public administration and political systems to reflect on trade-offs and opportunities. Bureaucracy is not the only answer, and public administration is not the synonymous of bureaucracy indeed. Moreover, public officials should be acknowledged as key actors of change, as the power they hold in their hands can make things happen. Is this all? What are we missing in the emerging constellations of networked actors influencing political decision-making? There is no innovation of democracy without organization, and public administration is there to make innovation possible. So, let's start. You both acknowledge that institutions and citizens have had a prominent role in the lead of innovations with a view to influence policy and decision-making. Public officials have equally gained traction in the mediation between elected and electors. So, by and large, the question about how innovations change bureaucracy continues to be open, right? Let's start from the first question. Do you think that bureaucracy change is a realistic goal of democratic innovations? And if so, which are the most visible pitfalls of bureaucracy that democratic innovations are able to intercept and possibly transform into something different that better fits to the purposes of citizen participation and deliberation? Stephen, would you like to start?
Yeah, certainly. And thanks very much for inviting me to join this talk today. Is it a realistic goal for democratic innovations to change bureaucracy? I don't think that's the purpose of democratic innovation. Rather, their aim is to enable citizens to have a great input into policy making. But through doing that, I think it can have an effect on bureaucracy. The bureaucratic systems and the bureaucrats can both be an enabler and a barrier to enabling members of the public through democratic innovations to input into policy making. Both the goals are very hard to achieve given the centralisation of power in our political system. Just because democratic innovations are in place and they're being used does not necessarily mean they are going to enable change to policy or bureaucracy. I think they can under certain circumstances, but we're still trying to understand what those circumstances are because it is very complicated. The conditions vary across different political systems. different types of bureaucratic regimes, different types of democratic innovations, different levels of governance, different policy issues, and other contexts will be important too. However, one of the most promising avenues, I think, for the relationship between democratic innovation and bureaucracy is what Mark Warren, who you've heard in a previous podcast in this series, termed governance-driven democratization. And this is the use of democratic innovation in public administration, particularly in the delivery of public services, for example, by unelected officials. And here, there's a big legitimacy gap of those public administrators as they're not elected, and yet they're making and interpreting decisions that affect people's lives on a daily basis. And I think there's a great need for democratic innovation in this space to enable citizens to have a say and to add some democratic legitimacy. As a result, there is then perhaps more hope that democratic innovations can have some influence over these aspects of bureaucracy. Collaborative governance, where bureaucrats, politicians, and citizens work together in collective decision making, I think is one of the most promising and most used democratic innovations in this space. Mini publics have also been used in this area of public administration.
Thank you, Stephen. Rikki, do you think that bureaucracy change is a realistic goal of democratic innovations?
Well, first, I just want to say thanks for organising this podcast on public administration. There's a few of us, people like John Boswell and I, who have been banging on for some years that we need to think more about public administrations. Before I answer your question, I want to step back just a tiny bit. I think bureaucratic change is a realistic goal of democratic innovations. It's actually, there's quite a good link between this podcast and the previous one with Oliver and Graham, because I think actually an explored aspect of democratic crisis at the moment is the role of public administration. And both we're seeing actually democratic theory refining public administration a little bit, but we're also in the scholarship on public administration seeing a new kind of focus on democracy. For a long time in public administration scholarship, democracy was just seen as like a taken for granted background condition. We didn't really need to think too much about democracy. Public administration just operates in the kind of context of a democracy. And really actually since Trump, I would say, this has been, particularly in American public administration, revised somewhat, right? Like there's given Trump's kind of attitude to public administration, and also on the far right, you see a lot of these debates around the deep state and the problems of the deep state. There's sort of been much more focus on, okay, how can actually public administration play a role in upholding democratic norms and democratic governance. And we see actually this is really important. I mean, in the US, for instance, when we were post the January sort of coup attempt, this could have gone very differently, right? If the US Army didn't have a commitment to democratic norms. Trump was trying very hard to get the army on side. And actually the generals kept coming out and slapping him down a bit. So we can see like the importance of democratic attitudes among sort of not usually seen as non-political actors in actually supporting democracy. So I think we're at a moment where we're seeing this kind of reconnection of debates around public administration and democracy, which I think is really important. That was my first kind of stepping back. The second point I think it's important to draw a distinction between administration and bureaucracy. Sometimes these things are used as synonyms. I wouldn't really see them as synonyms, right? So administration is essentially unavoidable. Whenever you have a group of people, which is relatively complex, and some people are tasked with doing something on behalf of others, then you have a form of administration. So even in a very small commune, you'd probably have some form of administration. Bureaucracy is just one way of organizing administration. There are other ways to organize administration. Most commonly, we talk about bureaucracy, markets, and networks, right? So I think we should not see these two things as synonymous. We always have to, in a kind of complex democratic society, we'll always have to have forms of administration. Our current societies tend to organize those mainly in terms of hierarchical bureaucracies, but this is not inevitable that they have to be organized in that way. So I just thought it's useful to bring that distinction in up front. And then to get to your question, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Stephen said already, particularly on the points about the political power of administration. the politics administration distinction that we've often seen, which is often, as John Boswell has written about, meant that public administration has been sort of somehow outside of democracy or adjacent to democracy. It's just a neutral process of implementation. I think this is very problematic. Stephen was talking about, there are many ways in which public administrators wield forms of political power. And if we don't see this as political, then it's essentially wielded untransparently. So we want to think about, how do we democratize the forms of political power that are wielded through administration? And then I think there's various different issues which have, if we think about democratic innovations, they're usually thought about in terms of the relationship between citizens and the institutions. I mean, we can think about, obviously, the relationship between public administration institutions and citizens. In some of the things that you were saying, I got the impression actually that you saw administrators maybe as a mediator between politicians and citizens, whereas I would see it the other way around. Like, politics is supposed to mediate between administration and the public. I mean, obviously, this is an oversimplified viewpoint, but we can think about that often we only think about a kind of dyad of relationships, right? Like citizens to politicians or citizens to administrators, but we can think about that triad of relationships as well. And how does that work in a kind of complex network? And we may think about, like, what's the extent of, many democratic innovations are deliberative democratic innovations. We may think about, well, what are the kind of deliberative quality of those relationships? Both internally, what is the deliberative quality of relationships between politicians? We do usually think about that, right? Like, we do try to understand how deliberative are parliaments. It's very rare that we actually focus on the internal deliberative quality of administrative organizations. But why would we not want, if we're deliberative democrats, why would we not want administrative organizations to also be organized deliberatively, and so on? And then you can also think about the relationships between those as well, between politicians and administrators. We often think about the relationships to citizens, but we tend to neglect the politician-administrator relationship. And this is actually quite a hot topic of debate in public administration at the moment, right? It's like, what should those relationships look like? How politicized should they be? And so on. So I think that's another area where we can think about the potential of democratic innovations. And then there's several problems of inequality as well in the way that public administrations deliver services and the way that they treat particularly marginalized groups. I mean, there's a well-established finding in public administration literature that they tend to treat middle-class people better than poorer people. Whereas this actually speaks to something that I criticized quite heavily in the public administration literature, which Stephen touched on, which is the focus on collaborative governance. A lot of the participatory innovations have been in terms of collaboration. This makes a lot of sense if you see the state as a good faith partner for deliberation and collaboration. But many marginalized groups do not see the state as a good faith partner for collaboration. And that's for very good reasons, because the state is quite an oppressive force in their life. And so we can also think about this, there's obvious democratic issues related to the extent to which people can obtain the rights to which they are legally entitled, right? And public administration is the thing that usually manages those entitlements. So if it operates in an unequal way, then there's an extent in which the legal rights that we have are also unequally implemented. And that has obvious democratic implications. And then the final one is just the perspectives, like whose knowledge counts in a democracy, right? Like, one role of public administration is sort of epistemic curation. Public administrations often decide what policies are possible and what not in a kind of informal way. Politicians make the final decision, but public administrations provide the evidence on which politicians decide. And so if they only listen to some people and not others, then this is also potentially drives what kinds of policies we get. So thinking about how can we diversify the perspectives and the knowledge that are counted when we make policy decisions is also, I think, a role that democratic innovations can play in democratizing administrative processes. Sorry, that was a really long answer.
Thank you. Well, let me say that actually you got that point. I was thinking of public officials as the mediators between politicians and citizens, but you're right. I mean, we should think the other way around, how politicians mediate between the public officials and citizens, and many other issues, of course, that I want to maybe we can further discuss later, like the connection, well, the link between the political power and administration, and how political power is somehow exerted by administrators within the public administration, and but also the levels of governance that were stressed by Stephen, which actually should be maybe better taken into account when we think on how governance works. I mean, we should think also about the levels of governance and how the different levels can have different impacts in the way democratic innovations are implemented. But let me now focus a bit on the connections that democratic innovations can have with the uh, let's say governance machinery, and this connection can be made in different ways, and scholars have discussed about different, however interconnected concepts like institutionalizations, embeddedness, but also deliberative systems, of course. And actually, Rikki, you recently argued that the deliberative character of bureaucracies should be a key question in understanding how deliberative a political system is, something that you already also said earlier. So this point highlights, in my view, how the issue of bureaucracy cannot be disjointed by the quality of political action. Do you feel that bureaucracy is still the best solution for that? And here I want to clarify, I'm understanding public administration as the container and bureaucracy as one of the models that we can use within that container. So, but do you think that bureaucracy is still the most adequate model that we can use for public administration? Have you ever imagined something radically different from the bureaucratic apparatus? And I don't know, have you ever thought of something that goes literally beyond the bureaucracy as we know it and still makes the state work in a participatory and deliberative way? Rikki, maybe you want to start with some inputs on that.
Yeah, sure. So I guess, I mean, I already hinted at this in some ways in the first distinction I made, right, between administration and bureaucracy. So usually we see that there are two alternatives to bureaucracy for organizing administration. One is markets. We've seen it, I would say, not in every country, but in a lot of countries. In the UK is a good example of this. The Netherlands also, where new public management has been very strong. A shift from bureaucracies towards more forms of market organization. The third one is networks. And actually, it's quite interesting in a way that the default here is to think about bureaucracy, because the public administration literature in a way often sees sort of bureaucracy as more old fashioned, and all of the focus is on network governance. The idea that modern forms of technology and so on have actually already shifted us to a system in which we're governed through networks and not by bureaucracies. In the same paper that you just referenced, I sort of pointed out that I'm slightly skeptical of this argument, at least the argument that we've already moved to forms of public administration through networks or through markets. I think if you actually look at what's happening, many of the actors in these networks and markets are still large bureaucracies, right? So a good example is the NHS, which is often seen as a form of network governance. And in one sense, this is true. The NHS is not one single bureaucratic organization, right? It's made up of a range of organizations. It also has a really large participatory system, actually. There's many different forms of or more patient and service user participation that happens in the NHS. But still, most of the actors within that network, it's also a kind of quasi-market system as well, are quite large bureaucracies. My wife actually works in the NHS. She's a psychologist. And so I hear how NHS professionals talk about each other, and they all know exactly what level they are in the bureaucracy, right? They say, like, I'm a level 8, that person's a level 5 and stuff. This is the hallmark of hierarchical organization, to know exactly what what stage you are in the bureaucracy, who's above you, who's below you, who has the accountability relationships to whom, and so on. I mean, these are all of the hallmarks of bureaucratic organization. And so to say that the NHS is now either a quasi-market or a network sort of belies the complexity of the picture. It's almost all of those three things, both a bureaucracy, a market, and a network. Depends where your point of focus is. And so I sort of find the debates around this, should we organize public administration in one or other of these ways, a little bit sort of oversimplified in one sense. What we're actually seeing is kind of complex amalgamations of those things. And that also has implications, I think, as well for the kinds of democratic innovations that you can do. So I wouldn't really necessarily see democratic innovations as contrary to the logic of bureaucracy. There are some kinds of democratic innovations which fit very neatly within the logic of bureaucratic forms of organization and are often used in that way. So I've written extensively about different logics of participation, right? And these are kind of linked to different understandings of public administration. And I think this is quite different from the kinds of typologies of democratic innovations we usually get, like Stephen and Oliver's, for instance, which is more focused on defining types of process. So if we think about Graham Smith's book, also Archon Fung's work, Stephen and Oliver's work, they tell us like there are these different kinds of process, deliberative mini-publics, participatory budgeting, referendums, and so on. I think that's very helpful. We obviously need to be able to distinguish between these different types of process. So this is not a critique of that. But one of the issues, I think, in the way that the democratic innovations literature has proceeded, and I think this is actually a little bit of a theme from the first episode of this podcast between Mark Horan and Tammy Pogrevinci, this kind of problem-based approach where we just look at what problems can a particular process solve, suggests that the processes themselves don't have any values embedded within them. So my approach is more to say, well, what values are actually embedded in different ways of organizing process as well. And actually, these processes can be quite flexible in the way that they are used. The deliberative mini-publics are quite a good example of that. They can do many different things. But the way that they're actually mostly used is very compatible with bureaucratic forms of organization. They're essentially used as a new way of doing consultation. It's kind of interesting in some ways to see them presented as if they're like radically new, because they seem to me just a new tool for doing very old practice. They give us a different way of selecting who's involved in those forms of consultation, but they're essentially just used as a normal form of consultation. I don't think this is really challenging to bureaucratic governance in any way. They're very used to doing consultations in which they kind of amass various different forms of evidence and then try to integrate it into a policy decision. So, of course, we can also do more radical forms of participation, and they are much more challenging to bureaucracy and hierarchical organization, right? Like if you want to devolve decision-making power to citizens, this does clash with the form of bureaucracy which sort of says that authority should be determined by expertise and kind of seniority and track records and so on. When you sort of say to bureaucrats, how about doing a deliberative mini-public where it actually makes a judgment and you don't make the judgment, and they find that very challenging. And they're like, yeah, but then what is my role? It sort of challenges their professional self-identity in some ways. So it's not so much the kind of process that is in itself challenging. It's the kind of way that you're using the process that can really determine whether it is changing the organizational logic of bureaucracy in some ways, particularly with deliberative mini-publics, which are quite flexible. I think participatory budgeting is often actually a way, often includes some devolution of power, right? Like that's the definition of it. But then you've also seen participatory budgeting in some ways, particularly in Europe, adapted so it becomes a much more consultative process in which it's not really challenging to the kind of institutional structures that exist. So, I mean, I think, Yves Saint-Omer, Anja Rocha, and some people have done quite a lot of work about this kind of translation of participatory budgeting between different areas and the way it's kind of transformed and so on. So I think kind of combining the kinds of work that Stephen has done with the processes to also think about the organizational logics, I think is kind of important in thinking about, are these processes challenging? Do they transform bureaucracy in some way, or are they just new ways of doing like the same old practices?
Good point. Stephen, what, what do you think about it?
Yeah, that's some really good points there, Ricky. Thanks. I mean, I think it is in terms of democratic innovations, like challenging the system. I agree with Vicky that it's how they're used rather than necessarily what the process is, because they can be used and are used in many different ways, and it is very difficult for them to challenge systems because the political system with state imperatives basically which dominate. But one of those state imperatives is legitimation. The state does need to legitimate itself, and that's our avenue of hope. That's where democratic innovations do have the potential to make some difference. You know, in public administration and bureaucracy, these are just extensions of this of the state, and that's why it's relevant. These are just different arms of it. And I agree as well with the different sort of organising logics as well. That we've got the state with bureaucracy and power. You've got the market with money, and you've got civil society or networks where there's persuasion, and therefore it's more horizontal. So there is more opportunity there. I agree with what Ricky's saying, that all three of those can be in play within one organisation like the NHS, and certainly interact within different administrative systems and units, etc. But I still think it's sort of like a helpful way to try and distinguish between different forms of power that operate within those administrations. In terms of thinking about something different, without the sort of state bureaucracy, have I ever imagined that? In my early work, I did stuff on associational democracy, sort of developing the work of Paul Hurst, where associations would be democratized. Again, picking up a point of Ricky that we want administrators to deliberate, so these associations would be deliberative spaces where citizens are members of those associations and therefore get to deliberate and have a say about what type of services they'd get and what they would receive, and therefore there'd be sort of like a complex mix of both exit and voice, because they'd also get to choose which associations to be part of. I don't know whether, I mean, that wouldn't remove bureaucracy altogether, but it would reduce state bureaucracy. There'd still be administration there, as Ricky said. We're always going to need, in collective organisation, there's always going to be some need for administration. So it'd be the associations that were delivering that, but hopefully following democratic norms. If they were democratised, as I outlined, that they should be around deliberative norms. So that would reduce state bureaucracy if such a system were in place. I don't know whether their associations count as democratic innovations, though, in the sense that they've been around for a long time, they're not new, but this would be a radically different role for them to fulfill. I mean, there's parts of the elements that go on with that already, in the sense that the state gives contracts to private firms, but also to voluntary associations to deliver public services. But they're not necessarily democratically organised in the way that they do that. I think another opportunity is the commons, sort of collective organisation over shared resources in civil society, as a way to sort of reduce state bureaucracy. Again, doesn't remove the need for administration, but does provide opportunities for the public to be actively involved in having a say over those collective resources and how they're used. So I think there are ways for democratic innovations to challenge bureaucratic systems. There are ways that we can move from those bureaucratic systems. But going back to the point I started with about state imperatives, because they're in place, it just makes it incredibly challenging, because you've got the whole state and its administrators basically pulling together to try and prevent any significant challenge to how the system currently operates.
Great. You both have been doing here some reference, of course, to the role of the administrators, and I would like to focus a bit more on their their role in and with democratic innovations. What I'm going to say maybe is not consensual. Actually, Rikki already said we should not think of the bureaucracy as I don't know, as the evil within the field of democratic innovation. There are good things that bureaucracy can actually deliver to democratic innovations. But if we think of some of the Weberian principles, like the division of labor within the public administration, but also the separation between an alleged neutral body, which is public administration, and the civil society, democratic innovations seem to mix this up a bit. However, challenges stem from breaking lines and boundaries. And for example, we have scholars writing about the discretionary power of street level bureaucrats in policy implementation, along with for example, the politicization of top level managers in policy design. So, do you think that these phenomena can be somehow exacerbated by democratic innovations? Or do you think that there is a chance to reframe roles and functions of administrators within new collective settings? I would like to hear from you. What do you think about changing the roles and the functions of administrators in this kind of setting?
So I would say I've thought a bit more about the street level bureaucrats than the top level managers question, to be honest. So, but I think that the top level manager, I'll start with that because I don't have so much to say about it. But I think it actually goes to something that Stephen was saying. So, like one of the dynamics that we've seen in democracy and the organization, particularly since the rise of new public management, is this process of agentification, right? Where instead of organizing in the traditional Westminster model, where you have an elected minister at the top of a bureaucracy who's kind of controlling the permanent secretary and then the bureaucrats within the ministry, we've seen this devolution of responsibilities to agencies, or sometimes called quangos. And this is where actually the most high profile public administrators usually sit right now. Like often you don't really know who naturally the permanent secretary is of the climate ministry, for instance, but you may know who the head of the central bank is. Or in the UK as well, the head of NHS England is a much more high profile political figure than the leading civil servant within the Department of Health. So these people do actually play a political role, and they do engage actively in democratic debates in the country in their kind of policy field. And so there is a kind of interesting question of legitimacy there, which Stephen also raised. And this is quite interesting, though, because what we sometimes see is this opens up a space for democratic innovations, right? So one of the things I studied was this process called NHS Citizen with Graham Smith and John Boswell, who wrote an article on this. And we saw that they organized quite an extensive participatory deliberative process. And this really came about because they were concerned about NHS England was newly created as a reform of the health system in the UK at that time. And they were sort of slightly worried about their democratic legitimacy. They're the body who distribute most of the spending on the national level for the NHS. And so they make a lot of important, essentially political decisions about where should resources be directed. And they sort of said, well, we're not so connected to the parliament and the legislature anymore because we're now an agency. So what gives us our democratic legitimacy? And then there was this attempt to organize this quite participatory, innovative process. It didn't quite work in the end, but it's interesting that the legitimation was clearly a factor in them actually trying to develop this process. So this sort of process of agentification, which has often actually been seen in some ways democratic because it removes or it distances important political decisions from the legislature, in other ways opens up avenues for new forms of democracy as well. So I think that's quite an interesting dynamic. On the street level bureaucrat question, I mean, the way that you frame discretion is that it's a problem. I mean, there's a lot of debate around whether discretion is a problem or not. The centre often sees street level bureaucrats' discretion as a problem because they're in some ways not as controllable, right? And if you see the democratic accountability and legitimacy is working in this very top-down manner, coming from the legislative through the ministry down to street-level bureaucrats. If they have the space for discretion, which is uncontrollable, then this is potentially a democratic problem. But there's actually quite a few political theorists who have been writing recently about this. So Cohen Bartels, Chiara Cordelli, also Bernardo Zacca, providing quite a lot of different perspectives on why actually discretion amongst street level bureaucrats is maybe not necessarily a democratic problem and why actually it's potentially something valuable. But I think actually this has a similar dynamic to the last one I mentioned, that when we actually admit, okay, discretion is just a fact, street level bureaucrats will have some kind of discretion, it's almost impossible to kind of eradicate that. Then we should think, okay, how is that discretion used in a democratic way? Because it can be used to kind of dominate people, or it can be used in a way that improves our kind of democratic functioning of the system. If we think about democracy functioning more on a kind of capillary level, right, rather than, we mainly think about parliament, which is like the heart of the democracy, but we could think about like, what are the kind of, how does democratic power and democratic practice function on this really micro level? And you often also find that this space for discretion is one where democratic practices can blossom. And we've known this for a long time within the democratic innovations literature. So if you even take like foundational works like Arcon Fung's work on community policing, this is essentially the democratization of the discretion of police officers, right? Like rather than them just deciding by themselves what's the kind of right way to police the neighborhood, they involve people in the local neighborhood in discussing their own priorities and so on. We have to think carefully about that, because it can be the case that this is actually used as a way to further marginalized groups, right? If this is not done well and not done in a democratic way. But it's not necessarily the case that it's a problem that street level bureaucrats have discretion.
If I can, I mean, I agree. I mean, discretion is not a problem per se. It's let's say the gateway to talk a bit more about the role of street level bureaucrats. You gave this good example of the NHS. I was wondering if Stephen wanted to, from your experience with democratic innovations on the field, what kind of discretion have you seen from policy officers, public officials?
I agree with the points that Rikki's made about, street level bureaucrats and the discretion they've had. And I mentioned before, governance driven democratization that Mark Warren's flagged up, because of their legitimacy gap, they will often have at least consultation processes, sometimes things that we'd call democratic innovation, sometimes more standard traditional forms of consultation. But they need it there because they're sort of well aware of the fact that they don't have the legitimacy to be making these decisions. Sorry to make this so English focused. Rikki mentioned NHS England before and NHS Citizen program that they had, and they're having going to have a citizens assembly, at least one this year on data use, which has been a very controversial topic within the NHS even before COVID and even more so. So as Rikki said, the NHS England do a lot of public consultation, but they tend to do it very badly, actually. But so we'll see how this citizen assembly develops. But the point that I wanted to make and relates directly to that was, if we are having an increase in the use of democratic innovations, then that can change the role of bureaucrats, administrators, whatever it is that we're wanting to call them. Because take, for example, the two Scottish Citizens Assembly of Scotland and Scotland's Climate Assembly that I was involved in the research on. In that system, you had civil servants from the relevant government departments forming a secretariat that were then responsible for the organisation of that Citizens Assembly. They didn't do it solo. They did it in conjunction then with sort of democratic practitioners organisations. But here you see, the different logics that we've been talking about bureaucracy, the market, and civil society. You can see all of them sort of interplayed into one assembly. Then you've got people from the state, basically, who are tasked with organising it. On one hand, there's opportunities there. It means, can they make sure that, the recommendations from the Citizens Assembly go to the right people? Can they get access to ministers and policymakers that a citizens' assembly might not have without their involvement in the Secretariat's involvement in the organisation of it. But the other hand is are they going to make sure that it's organised so that it isn't, we're talking about democratic innovations challenging systems. Are they going to organise it in a way to make sure that it isn't challenging the system? They have a lot of discretion there in deciding the remit of the assembly, what evidence they're going to hear. Of course, then they have these steering groups, advisory boards, etc., that try and sort of show that the governance of the citizen assembly isn't skewed, but there's still elements there where it can be. So it's a trade-off, and this relates directly to sort of like the problem of Weber that you raised, Roberto, which is, the attention between democratic innovations being democratic but also being effective. Weber talks a lot about the tension between effective and democratic decision making, and democratic decision making can struggle to be effective, and that's the tension problem facing many democratic innovations. So if we don't have civil servants from the state organising these things, then is it organisations from civil society perhaps doing it, or organisations that are in the market and trying to make a profit out of this? Again, it doesn't seem like any of those are ideal. And if we're going to if democratic innovations are going to be taken seriously, embedded and institutionalized in our political systems, as the terms you mentioned earlier, Roberta, we need something like an electoral commission, that oversees its organization. You wouldn't allow the states, you wouldn't allow the government to oversee its own election. And when that does happen in political systems, we don't consider it to be a democratic election. So there are huge problems with the organisation and the administration and the bureaucracy around democratic innovations in general. I just gave citizens' assemblies as a particular example that we really haven't done enough research about or theorised enough either.
Can I just come back on a couple of things that Stephen said? Because
go.
I'll just sort of emphasize what he's saying in one respect. Because I've done some work talking to civil servants about their kind of preferences for participatory governance, right? And actually, you find that they're relatively diverse on this question. And one of the troubles that I think that they have is that the training is still kind of, it depends where they sit in the bureaucracy, and it depends on their sort of personal career trajectory as well. But many of the sort of career civil servants are trained in almost a kind of bureaucratic sort of Weberian logic of thinking about their own role. Others actually come, so I found like quite a distinction between those civil servants and the ones that had come from a more kind of civil society background, who really actually saw themselves as kind of activists in the machine, actually trying to make it more participatory. And the ones who were sort of trained in the bureaucratic Weberian logic, who saw actually participation as a kind of threat to their professional self-identity. And so if we're doing more of this, and I think there is an openness in the civil service to doing more participatory work and so on, right? Like there is a big open government movement, which I think civil servants and public officials find relatively convincing, or at least many of them. But it does also challenge their kind of ingrained way of working for some of them. And as Stephen said, it also complexifies in some ways the logics of the organization, in which there's sort of multiple pressures in which they then have to navigate rather than one. If you think about my role is in a hierarchical bureaucracy, and I just have to respond to the people who are higher up to me and do what I am commanded to do, like the command and control. This is a relatively straightforward accountability relationship. If you see my role is my accountability is just to the public, and I can ignore what my bosses are saying and always just think about the public interest. This is a kind of quite a simple way of thinking about your relationship. But when you have both of those pressures coming from up and down, and you have to sort of in some way negotiate the two of them, then this kind of creates a lot of ambivalence, I think, for civil servants, right? And actually giving them a way to sort of think a bit more flexibly about their role is actually potentially useful, right? They don't always have to be the decision maker or the curator of the expertise. Sometimes they can be more of a facilitator and so on. And sort of, I think actually the process of training civil servants could be much better in preparing them for how they can deal with participatory forms of organization. And then they would come up against much less resistance, I think. And actually in recognizing that these people are subject to multiple competing pressures, particularly street level bureaucrats who are often in quite close contact with the public. Less so, I think, for people working in the ministries. And so, yeah, I think Stephen was kind of touching on that with what he was talking about in the Citizens Assembly there, is that actually this is a kind of unusual way of working for many people. It brings in new pressures, and they actually don't have the training or even sort of mental models for thinking about what is my role in this situation. And for us to provide them with some ways of thinking about that would be quite useful. The other thing I wanted to push back on a little bit, the tension between democracy and effectiveness. So, I mean, of course, there is sometimes a tension between that, but of course, epistemic Democrats would push back on that quite hard and say actually democracy is a route to effectiveness. And I think you often also see this a lot in participatory forms of public administration. They're not necessarily doing the participation because they're committed participatory Democrats or committed deliberative Democrats. They're doing it because they think it makes the policymaking process more effective. So they're trying to get at neglected forms of expertise and so on that they wouldn't be able to get at otherwise in order to improve the effectiveness of policymaking.
You mean more instrumentally, right?
Yeah, so more instrumental rationale for doing participation. And so I sort of would not really want to frame that there's this real tension between effectiveness and democracy, because I think actually it can be the case that there is, but it can be the case that actually they are mutually reinforcing. And definitely public administrators, like the normative order is one of effectiveness, right? So we want to present these opportunities to them that they will improve effectiveness. And I think they genuinely usually do improve effectiveness of the policy making process to get a wider range of perspectives and so on. So I think thinking about the way that a more democratic process can enhance effectiveness, and in some ways challenging Weber's point on that would be a more fruitful way of getting public officials on side. Then,
do you agree, Stephen? Do they really contribute to improve democracy effectiveness?
I wouldn't disagree, but I think the fact that if the only support for these things is that instrumental support and they're not seen as legitimate in their own right, then just continue with the ad hoc approach, which is dominated, and they'll be used when it's instrumentally helpful and discarded and not used when that instrumental rationality isn't there.
Yeah. Let me ask you a last question, which has to do with the change within the organization. I mean, actually, the change of organizational cultures within public administration, which is not a mere issue of organizational change, but actually is also a political issue. And here, I mean, we mean political in the broadest sense. So, of course, not just about the elections, for example. And actually, democratic innovations do have something to say in this regard. What do you think that we are missing to put democratic innovations at the forefront of this debate on bureaucracy change? I mean, I've been wondering, for example, if the focus on the state may be too narrow at times, and if we are overlooking the constellations of other actors, networked actors that influence de facto politics beyond the boundaries between state and civil society. So not that straightforward understanding of, you have on the one hand the state and on the other hand the civil society. So what's your thought on that? What are we missing?
So I've mentioned, I think we do need action within civil society, and I think opportunities for collective organisation and collective control over resources within civil society, I think, is a key way to democratize public administration. I've flagged already my work on associational democracy. I flagged the work that's sort of emerging around the commons, which I think are two really useful ways to do that. But I would go back to a previous point from Rikki, and I think that's been a theme of our talk, which is, we can't get away from this state bureaucracy. We can't get away from state administration. So there are ways to lessen it and change it along the ways I've just mentioned. But it's still going to be there. And then, sort of going back to sort of Habermas, we therefore still need avenues that are going to connect public opinion in the informal public sphere, to use his terminology, with where decisions are actually made in government and in public administration, in bureaucracy, in the formal public sphere. And traditionally in democratic systems, we look to political parties and elections to be those avenues, and whether they were working or not, or functioning well or not ever, is an open question. But it's certainly widely perceived that they're not doing those roles well now, and this is the context in which we've seen the increase in emphasis on new forms of political participation, such as democratic innovation. So we will always, we need these new processes to provide that link, and that's what I still see as their key function within the political system.
Yeah, Rikki.
Yeah, so there was actually a bit of a discussion on this in your last podcast, right? And I agreed with a lot of what Graham Smith and Oliver Escobar were saying on that. So I think there are 2 points that I would sort of pick up from what they said. So one, Graham Smith mentioned, and this is something that Graham Smith, John Boswell, and I have written about, I guess, is that democratic innovations in one way had a bit of an over focus on their connection to the state. And yeah, I sort of wholly agree with that point. And I think it's still problematic in the way that some, not only academics, but also civil society organizations are driving the direction of democratic innovations at the moment. There's a lot of focus on institutionalization. And the idea is that this institutionalization will solve a problem of lack of impact. And coming from a public administration angle, I'm relatively skeptical of that, because I've seen that public consultations have been institutionalized for many, many years, and they often have absolutely no impact. And actually, what sort of challenged it for me was looking at the German citizens, like the German experience of the citizens' assemblies. So both the Bürgerrat Demokratie and the Klimabürgerrat, so Citizens' Assembly on Democracy and the Citizens' Assembly on Climate. And these were both carried out by civil society organizations without any kind of official formal link to state organizations. And this actually forced them to work in quite different ways to ones that were heavily connected to the state. So they had to get on board, for instance, a wide support of civil society organizations. They did also connect with sort of supportive people within the Bundestag or other state organizations or the political parties and so on. And they also tried to sort of organize various forms of campaign activity and so on. And part of the reason they did this is because they didn't have a institutionalized relationship to the state, right? So they had to generate kind of informal forms of power and influence in order to try to make sure that this process had any kind of impact. And I think that's actually something that's quite valuable. My argument is essentially that if you have a process like a deliberative mini-public, which is highly connected to the state, so a ministry carries out a deliberative mini-public, it makes some recommendations that go to the bureaucrats who have to respond. Why would anyone else pay attention to that? There's no like call to action or anything, right? Like no one else pays attention to normal processes of consultation. So why would they pay attention to this just because it's randomly selected? It doesn't make any sense to me that this will really sort of drive the impact of deliberative mini-publics in any way. So I'd rather see these deliberative mini-publics as a kind of focal point for more, particularly on things like climate and sustainability, these issues where you need a lot of buy-in from the public. I'd like to see them as sort of focal points for a broad societal conversation in which both politicians are involved, but also broad sets of civil society groups and so on. And this kind of narrow form of institutionalization, I'm not sure it would do that. I mean, I'm not wholly convinced of my own argument here. Like maybe sometimes if you institutionalize this thing and give it like a real heft, then maybe that does encourage a broader social conversation around it. Obviously, we saw that with the Irish example. But the interesting thing about the Irish example is that really the ones that got a lot of debate and public conversation were the ones that went to referendum. And there's a clear call to action for the public, right? The public have to vote on this. And then there's a clear reason for why the media should report on this, because part of the media's role is to communicate important political issues to the public where they need to be informed. So that form of institutionalization, I think, is very different from the kind of institutionalization as like a normal part of consultation and institutional action. I'm not sure that this would lead to much influence. And then I also agreed with Oliver that we tend to overdo the distinction between sort of state and civil society. And often those things are actually a bit more connected than when we see them as kind of separate homogenous groups. There's someone at LSE called Armin Ishkanian who came up with this idea called symbiotic symbiosis. She was actually talking about the relationship between NGOs and sort of social movements, in which they often deny that they're related to each other. And actually, I think you can see things like that as well between NGOs and state organizations, right? Like, actually, the actors often move between them. Often, like if we look at the civil society organized citizens' assemblies that I mentioned in Germany, they included members of the Bundestag, often quite high-profile ones who were very supportive of the process. And this is then what led to the Bundestag kind of later organizing its own citizens' assemblies. So I think there's often actually a lot more sort of transmission going on between these than we actually give them credit for when we see, like, okay, there's state on one side and civil society on the other. I think they're a bit more networked than that.
Thank you, Stephen and Rikki, and thank you all for joining us in this 4th episode of Democratic Innovations. This podcast is sponsored by the EU-funded project INCITE-DEM, the Institute of Social Sciences of the University of Lisbon, the Center for Ecology, Evolution and Environmental Changes, and the Competence Center on Participatory and Deliberative Democracy of the European Commission. This episode was produced by me, Roberto Falanga, with the collaboration of Eleonora Tulumello, who also handled live sound engineering, editing, and post-production. You can follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter at INCITE-DEM, Citizens Reinventing Democracy, for updates and additional content. Follow us on YouTube too.